So I'm going to be talking about scope and objectives. And one of the things, again, as I said, I love like Jannine's talk and her project. But with her talk, I loved how she was framing it around, here are the questions we asked and the answers we gave to those questions. The answers you give to questions like that, they're going to, well, to make things rhyming, right? Studies show that people remember things better when you rhyme things. So it all depends on your desired ends. The first time we did the vulnerability assessment training, scope and objectives was much later in the training. But we found, we'd give a presentation, people were like, well, should we do it this way or that way? And we'd say, well, it depends on your scope and objectives. So we've moved this up because as you go through the capstone, as you go through the rest of the course, the training, the answer to a lot of the questions that you might have about what should we do, it's going to come back to what is it that you want to do? What are you trying to accomplish? So Lewis Carroll, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. It was interesting as folks were introducing themselves. Several of you, it sounds like you're at the beginning, you've just gotten some funding, you're at the beginning of some climate change projects. So take just a minute here and think to yourselves, where are you hoping to go with these projects that you're starting? What do you want to accomplish with them? Just think for a minute. And then you could also think, how does that relate to what I want to get out of this training? Yeah.
We're just looking for a beginning.
You're just what?
Looking for a beginning.
You're just looking for a beginning.
We're just now learning about this. We'd like to know the beginning of everything. How do we go about it?
How do you go about even thinking about climate change?
Yes, finding out what like in our area, what all we need to do, or to find out what's going on in our area.
So why do you want to find out what's going on with climate change? Why do you even care?
The president does, and she asked us to start caring too. So now we're in it. We're ready to get started in it.
Right. So the president of your
tribe,
yeah. She said, we got to worry about climate change. So that meant you work for her, you got to worry about climate change.
Exactly.
Excellent. So that's one reason you might care. Where am I trying to get to? I want to make my boss happy, my president happy. Other people who are here with climate change projects, why do you care? What do you hope to get out of your climate change projects?
Protecting culturally sensitive species.
Protecting culturally sensitive species, right? And why do you care about that?
Just the past history of it all. It's been a staple for people for so long. It's a shame to watch it go away.
Right. Past history, things that have mattered forever, you don't want to lose them. And we'll get into, it's kind of funny, you come up with your presentations and you have your order of slides, but then you start interacting with people and you skip around. But so one of the core questions you want to ask, you're trying to say, well, what are my fundamental objectives? You kind of ask, why do you care? And obviously you can keep asking, why do you care? Like I could say, well, why do you care that these things have been around forever and it would be a shame to watch them go? But really, it sounds like, when you were at that, we care about culturally sensitive species, you're already sort of at your fundamental objective. This is a core value to us, or who we are, as a people, or so. I might keep asking, well, why do you care about that? But at some point you could say, because that's a central value. Other people thinking about climate change, just starting projects, why do you care, or how do you want to use the results? That was another thing I love in Paul's presentation. Step number 4, right? It's using the vulnerability assessment results. I remember when I started graduate school, someone gave me the advice that said, well, when you're planning a research project, you want to visualize before you even start the project, you want to visualize what sort of graphs and tables you would have. What are the outputs going to look like? And I think that can be true of vulnerability assessments or adaptation plans as well. Before you start to say, well, what do I want this to look like at the end? So other uses of vulnerability assessments or other things people are hoping to see from their adaptation plans.
Integrating climate change into our plans, whether it's our water plan or drought plan.
right? So integrating climate change into plans, right? That's actually really interesting, teaching this training for a bunch of years now. Early on, almost everyone who came to the training was, I want to do a vulnerability assessment so I can write an adaptation plan. But over the years, we're getting a lot more people who are like, I want to do a vulnerability assessment so I can do a good job writing my species recovery plan, my drought plan, my whatever. Some people are still thinking about writing adaptation plans, but a lot of people are now thinking about, I want to keep doing what I'm already doing, which is, water planning, drought planning, fire planning. I'm not trying to do an adaptation plan. I just want to make sure I've integrated climate change into the decisions I'm making. Right, so those might be two different pathways. Any other thoughts on that before I hit slide number 2? 3, however you count these things. All right, so good objectives. Help make sure that you're solving the right problem. So, another interesting thing about Janine's presentation, they had one geographic area they were going to use, and then it turned out, well, no, they had to expand that because they had started out with one perspective, but as they brought partners on board, they realized they were solving sort of a different problem. So you want to know your objectives so you can say, well, how am I going to do this vulnerability assessment? What information do I need? Right, so for Janine's, in terms of tribal engagement, right, they were only peripherally involving tribes. That wasn't a focus, so they probably didn't care that much about information related to cultural significance, specifics about use, this species matters in this way, or this place has particular value in this way. That wasn't so important for their project. But I'm guessing for all of you who are working for tribes, members of tribes who are motivated by the cultural significance of species, cultural information is going to be pretty darn relevant and important. And again, with information, with a project like Janine, something that's purely federal or state and federal, people often want to say, who's got the information? How can we get all the information together and put it up on one big website and share it? That's really different with tribes, right? You probably don't want a bunch of tribal information going on to any federal site, because then people could do Freedom of Information Act and have access to information in ways that you don't control. And you might not even want some of that information up where anyone else can see it besides people from within your tribe. So there are a lot of different things to think about in terms of information management. Making decisions during the vulnerability assessment process. As you heard from Janine, as they were going along, they would say, well, how should we do this, or how should we do that? Do we have to change? You will come up with questions, decisions you have to make during the process, and the clearer you are about what you're trying to achieve with your vulnerability assessment, the better you'll be able to answer those. And then finally, getting the results used. Again, a lot of times early on in the vulnerability assessment trainings, in the early years, people would say things like, this is like the myth of scientific objectivity. Well, we're the scientists, we're just going to do a vulnerability assessment for these species, and then people will use those results. And I say, well, who do you want to use those results? And they say, no, we're the scientists, we can't possibly think about who's going to use these results, because that's not our business as scientists. We're just putting the objective information out there. But if you want the vulnerability assessment results to be used, then you have to think about who might use them and how, because in the back of your head, as you're doing an assessment, you'll have sort of assumptions about how people might use this information. And if you don't make those explicit, then you're minimizing the chance that anyone will be able to use them. So you can't do a single vulnerability assessment that provides everyone with everything they might need for an adaptation plan, because the information will be different, the output will be different. So, well, actually, getting back to this slide, one other thought on that. A lot of tribes are very capacity limited, right? You don't have a whole lot of people working. You have like 20 people in your natural resource management department. So when a lot of tribes, when they're thinking about okay, do we want to do a vulnerability assessment? Can we just hire someone to do it for us? Because we don't have the staff in-house to do it. That's where you'd want to think carefully about, well, how do we want to use the results? Who's going to use them? What information do we need? If you hire an outside consultant just to come in and do the vulnerability assessment, will they know the questions to ask? Will they know what matters? Really, when they're making judgment calls, because you make judgment calls all the time, will they have the background to know what judgment calls they can just make themselves, when they need to ask someone? And again, if there's information, if there's culturally sensitive information that matters for the vulnerability assessment, if you hire an outside contractor, can you even share with them the information? Would you feel comfortable sharing with them the information that they would need to do the vulnerability assessment you wanted? And with all of these questions, right, there's not a right or a wrong answer to any of these. It's not, well, of course you wouldn't hire an outsider after asking all those questions. You might still decide, yeah, ideally we would have someone from within our tribe do this assessment, but we really don't have the capacity, so we are going to hire an outside person. But at least you want to know what you're missing. Like, if you do it by hiring an outside person, what will you not get? If you do it internally, what will you get or not get? So again, no right or wrong answers to these questions, but you want to ask them so you know how to interpret your results. Okay. So talking about goals and objectives, you can have your goals and objectives for yourself as an individual. I want to make my boss happy, you know? And it's true, again, we've had some people in these vulnerability assessment trainings. The Forest Service, I guess, has the, what they call it, the scorecard or the grade book or whatever. And so we had some people in there, it's like, well, I want to be able to check that box that I've done a vulnerability assessment. And it's like, all right, you know what? You've just saved yourself a lot of time and money, because there's almost certainly a vulnerability assessment out there that covers your forest area, so you can just say, there it is, check that box. You know, and on the one hand, it's kind of sad. I think there are a lot of good reasons to think about climate change and do a vulnerability assessment. But if that really is, as an individual, your only motivation, good to know that. So you can have your individual goals and objectives. You can have, you know, the tribe might have its goals and objectives. You can have your conservation goals and objectives, all kinds of levels of goals and objectives. So you might say our vulnerability objective, the vulnerability assessment objectives, those are within all of these other objectives and your personal objectives. And you want to sort of think at all levels, and then when you're planning your vulnerability assessment, narrow it down to, okay, so given all of these big goals and objectives or my personal goals and objectives, what am I going to do here? And feel free to break in any time with comments. So setting goals and objectives. As you're starting your vulnerability assessment, you want to think about what problems are you addressing? Is your primary problem, you know, my boss wants me to do this thing, so I have to make my boss happy? You know, and people like to say those things don't matter, but they do matter, right? If you want to get funding, say, if you want to convince your tribal council to spend a lot of money or to spend staff time on a vulnerability assessment, you want any preliminary work you do to be something that'll show them the value, you know? So what problems are you addressing? What decisions need to be supported? This gets back to, are you doing an adaptation plan, or are you doing a fisheries management plan? Are you doing a drought plan? Who makes those decisions? Again, like, if your tribal council makes the decisions, then you want to make sure that it focuses in ways that helps them make their decisions. If it's for, you know, if you were, I don't know, doing a vulnerability assessment to inform a legal case, you'd want to say, okay, you know, how do the judges think? You know, what can we do that's going to help the judge make the decision that we want? You know, what do you ultimately want to achieve with this? So, again, those of you who are doing climate change projects or adaptation plans, what would you say in terms of problems you're addressing, decisions you're supporting? You've got your president, like Great Lakes fish people, do you have a big reason why you're doing the climate project? Do you know what goals and decisions?
I think the overall idea is that as an agency that assists in the co-management of the resources, we need to understand how the resources are changing in order to manage those resources.
Right. So the co-management of resources. So that's interesting. What does co-management mean to you? In other words, as tribal fish people, how would your approach and your thinking be different than just your generic NOAA fisheries person? If you could NOAA fisheries do a vulnerability assessment for fish species that would be everything you needed, or as tribal?
Feel free to jump in here.
Yeah.
But I guess I was speaking for myself. I would say that the importance of that species to the tribes or tribal member might be entirely different, and for different reasons from a DNR manager, for example, for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. In terms of,
I don't know, culturally significant. It's less of a, not the specific numbers approach, but rather is it important for different reasons, culturally, historically, whatever it might be.
right, so the meaning of a fish might be different for a tribe than it would be for, say, State Department of Natural Resources. The Department of Natural Resources might be fine saying, well, we want to have this many fish. If we've got that many fish, we're happy. But for some people, that's like saying, yeah, well, if we've reduced murders by this amount, that's great. Or like some things are moral to count, some things are not moral to count. In some cultures, or with fish, dams are a big issue. And so if you talk about, you want to talk about your fundamental objectives. So a lot of people might say, at West, like, my objective, I want to, take down all the dams. And then you could say, well, why do you want to take down the dams? And for some people, I think this is more of a non-tribal perspective. They might say, well, I want to take down the dams so that we can have healthy fish populations. And they say, well, what if I could guarantee you healthy fish populations with the dam still in place? Would you be happy? And some people might say, yeah, actually, I would be. But other people might say, I think it is a fundamental moral wrong to have a dam in that river. Like that is like changing something that should not be changed. And in that case, even if you could have like fabulous fish populations with the dam in place, that's not the point. The point is that you've got this thing that's just wrong out there. So again, you want to ask, what are your fundamental objectives? So anyone else have thoughts on problems they're addressing or decisions they're supporting?
Availability of a cultural resource or a cultural species for use in the future.
The availability for use in the future. Yeah, right, and that's right. Will the resource be available? And again, you want to get if there's a spatial component to that too. You want it to be available in particular places, or can it be available anywhere? Right, we're having a conversation over break about saving seeds. Right, can you save seeds? That's another commonly suggested adaptation plan, is like create seed banks and plant things in particular places in greenhouses or whatever to save them. If you care not just about the survival of the species, but there's some element of the species that makes it you can't preserve that core aspect of what the species means by growing it in a greenhouse or saving seeds. So those are questions you would say, what are our objectives? Is it just having bodies of fish around? Is it just making sure this plant is somewhere in the world? Or is there some aspect of what the fish means, what the plant means, that will change how you can think about climate change vulnerability and adaptation? Tips for writing good objectives. And I also want to say, hopefully one of the things you'll get out of the training here, you're gonna have this capstone exercise where you'll run through a vulnerability assessment sort of really quickly. we ask you at the beginning to say, okay, come up with your goals and objectives for this vulnerability assessment. But pretty much everyone, as you go through the vulnerability assessment, you'll say, oh, that's not really our goal. Our goal is something else. And that happens in real life too. So you want to spend enough time up front being clear on your goals and objectives, but also be aware that as you go through the process of vulnerability assessment or adaptation planning, you might have new insights. For instance, if you start out with, what we care about is, healthy populations of fish, but we also really do care about the dams. And that's focusing on fundamental objectives more than how you'd achieve them. So again, if your fundamental objective is healthy fish populations, then you could achieve that by having dams or not having dams or hatcheries. But if your fundamental objective is, having the system in harmony, and that means not having hatcheries, then that's different. And you can have multiple. You almost always do have multiple objectives, and sometimes they will be conflicting. And that's when you have to think about trade-offs and how are you going to, if you can't achieve everything you want, how do you decide what you're satisfied with? So this gets back to what I was saying at the beginning, and when Josh was saying, we care about these culturally important species because they've been there, they've been part of our culture forever. So when you're trying to get at your fundamental objective, ask yourself, if you say, this is what I care about, ask yourself, why is that important? And when you're like, well, just because, that's essential, or you might say because it's a law, that's important, inherent value, then that's your fundamental objective. So an example of how this might work, and again, in the federal world, we often see people say, well, my objective here is to get some downscaled climate models for my fabulous national park. And it's like, okay, you say that's your objective. Why does that matter to you? What problems are you addressing? Another thing I say, you can, if you want to test, have you gotten to your fundamental objective, you can say, if all you achieved is what you said there, would you be satisfied? So in this case, it's like, if I said, great, here's some downscaled climate projections, would you feel totally satisfied? Like, yes, I've achieved my objective. Or would you say, well, no, actually, I want more than the downscaled climate projections. So then you might say, well, I want the downscaled climate projections because if there's more exposure to climate change, right? Remember Paul talking about exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. If there's more exposure, that's more vulnerability, and that means I'm going to have to do some more managing. Well, so then you could say, well, why manage? Why are you managing the parks? And so then you could say, a bunch of different answers. Maybe you're managing to prevent extinction, or maybe you're managing to set budgets or meeting legal requirements. But so you can keep asking why, and then these would be sort of at the fundamental level. And you can see if the person asking this question is setting budgets, they're going to be looking at different information than someone who's interested in preventing extinctions. And they'll be setting budgets differently. So someone who wants to prevent extinction, they have to think about budgets, but they're going to think less about balancing the money budget than about doing all they can to prevent extinction. So what I want to do now, I have a few examples of possible objectives for climate change vulnerability assessments. And so I just look at this and think about, how is this as a fundamental objective? Is this really, do you think this is the fundamental objective? How might you restate or add to this objective to make it fundamental? And just, if I can move it forward, those are the sort of the why is it important questions. The objective of my climate change vulnerability assessment is to understand the relative vulnerability of culturally important species to climate change.
Some of those are all cultural identity. If you don't understand, you don't know who you are. So you have to address the cultural important species so you can remain who you are. And if you're not addressing those and you're losing those, you're going to lose who you are. So you have to understand the vulnerability of those things, that whether it be wildlife or aquatic, plants, water. If you don't understand how those are important to who you are.
Right. So essentially, so what she's doing is getting at the question of why is that important. She said, well, these culturally important species matter because they're part of, your identity, part of who you are. And so you want to understand about the culturally important species because you want to understand who you are and how you can continue to be who you are. It's another interesting conversation we had over break is what is the core of different traditional practices. There's a book called The Whale and the Supercomputer, looking up in Barrow, Alaska, so super far north. And it's sort of about that tension between Western science and the Inupiat villages up there. And I mean, it's interesting in all kinds of ways. But so this one guy they're interviewing, so the Inupiat up there, they've always been whale hunters, and they never stopped. And in fact, it's because they're so remote, like you cannot grow vegetables up there. You have to eat a lot of this. You need a lot of the fat for the calories because it gets so cold there. Like you need the fat. And so if a village doesn't get its own whale, that matters so much that people from other villages that have gotten whales will send a whale to villages that didn't get their own, partly because of the cultural importance, but also because just calorie-wise, it's hard to get what you need without it. And so this one guy there who's a whaleboat captain, whaleboat there not meaning like the big commercial whaling ships, but the individual boats, he said, we go out now in motorboats and we use shoulder grenade launchers to get the whales. And some people who don't want us to be killing whales anyway say, you should be doing this the traditional way, which is in skin boats and with harpoons, hand-thrown harpoons. And he said, what they don't understand is the core of our tradition isn't the skin boats and the harpoons. The core of our tradition is getting the food that matters to us nutritionally, and that matters to us spiritually and culturally. It's getting that food in the way that is safest for us and most humane for the whale. The power boats are way safer for us than the skin boats. And even though it sounds brutal, the shoulder launch grenade is way more humane for the whale than the harpoon. Because with the harpoon, you stick the harpoon in the whale, and then it's swimming around forever, dragging us after it until it's tired enough when we can, get close to it and kill it. So I thought, that's great. From the outside, people were saying, no, the core of your tradition is the skin boats and the harpoons. But from the inside, it's no, the core of our tradition is getting what we need culturally, spiritually, nutritionally, in a way that's safe and humane. And so they're thinking about the relative vulnerability of culturally important species to climate change. They say, well, what you care about isn't this species as a biological entity necessarily. What you care about is that species as part of your identity. And so then it's the vulnerability, not just of that species to climate change, but how is our culture, how is our identity responding and changing? So, and I wouldn't want to say tribes are so lucky to have experienced all these terrible things they've experienced because it gives you perspective. But the fact is, like a lot of the people here, you have experienced, what does it mean if you are, as a people, taken from your homeland and moved somewhere else? How do you maintain your identity when there's so much change around you? Out west, all of the tribes, up the Columbia River, that salmon was the focus of their world in a lot of ways. The big dams went up, all of a sudden they had no more salmon. So you can sort of say, well, how have we responded in the past when something totally changed our cultural context? And you can use that to inform going forward. Again, it's not that you're lucky to have experienced that, but you have experiences that help you answer questions about when the world totally changes. How do we continue? Other thoughts about this? How might you change this the statement if you wanted to make it, if you were doing a climate change vulnerability assessment, would you be happy with this as your objective statement, or how might you change it? Right. That's really interesting. So the objective of my climate change vulnerability assessment is to understand the vulnerability of, and you're saying, is everyone going to have the same understanding of what vulnerability means? And there was before the most recent national climate assessment, there was a workshop in Atlanta to talk about, vulnerability assessments and what do they mean and how do we do them, and is there a unified practice for that? And so there were people from the public health world, people from the infrastructure world, people from the natural resource management world, and people had really different definitions of it. So that's great. You might want to change it to say not the relative vulnerability of species, but maybe you want to say understand the relative exposure of species to climate change, or the ability of culturally important species to respond and adapt and continue. Right. That's a great question. Or great suggested revision. So here's another, and again, these are just things I've sort of made up, but they represent the types of objectives I've seen a lot of. So I want to do a vulnerability assessment to inform the air quality monitoring program I'm developing for my tribe. Would you change that statement at all? Would you add anything to that fundamental objective? Everyone think it's great?
I guess inform isn't very specific. You might want to include what you expect to be able to change about your monitoring program with the information you get out of the assessment.
Right, so you might say, instead of just inform the air quality monitoring program, you'd say, well, here are the decisions I make as part of my air quality monitoring. Here, I'm thinking, if I think about climate change, maybe I will monitor something that I don't monitor now, or maybe I'll monitor it more frequently, or at different times. And again, I want to point out, there aren't, I'm not saying, oh, this is bad, you have to change it. There aren't right or wrong answers. You just want to ask yourself, should I be a little more specific than this? Is there something else I care about? That's a good one. Maybe you monitor water quality at particular times, but with climate change, if things are getting warmer sooner, you're getting more droughts and floods, maybe you need to change when you monitor so that you capture the different types of changes you'll be seeing. And earlier I'd mentioned you almost always have more than one objective. So this objective statement actually captures several objectives. So my goals are to assess the vulnerability of natural resources important to tribes in our area. We don't know how much analytical work we can fit into our timeline and our budget. So we want to choose a method that is realistic and practical and produces good results. Right, so here you've got the, one objective is assessing vulnerability of natural resources. And then you might want to adapt that, as we talked about with that first objective, but you've got this other objective, you've got a timeline and a budget, and so you want to find a method that will fit into that timeline and budget. And again, this is something I'm hoping you think about throughout the training. We have this particular vulnerability assessment we'll walk you through in the exercise, or you'll walk through in the exercise. And so you can do that, obviously, as part of this 3-day training. So that's, would be pretty cheap and fast. But if you look at all these other assessments people have done, they won't all be relevant. You don't have to do things the way other people have done. There aren't even any standard good practices for vulnerability assessments yet. So if you've got a timeline and budget, don't feel like you have to do exactly what someone else did. But you can use what other people did to say, why did they do that? Can I leave that part out of it and still have a good assessment? It may be that if you think about it, you're like, you know what, within our timeline and budget, we can't do anything. And so then maybe you say, ultimately we want to, this is what we want to do assessment-wise. We're going to keep our eye out for funding sources where we could apply for that. And Ashley was saying, I'm running out of time, but I just want to talk to the computer. These are some of the responses from the background survey. People talked about what they were doing, what their job responsibilities were. So we had some people developing a climate adaptation plan, some people writing grants, some people working on NEPA documents. It's kind of funny, I have a project now looking at building climate change into habitat conservation planning, which is a Fish and Wildlife Service regulatory process. And so it actually makes me, like when I see, NEPA documents, I really enjoy regulatory processes now, or thinking about climate change and regulatory processes, because, for better or worse, there's a lot that happens, decisions that get made as a result of these regulatory processes. So doing them well is good. Supporting a specific tribe. Some people were supporting one tribe, some people were supporting multiple tribes. So just think about those different sort of job sets. How might the vulnerability assessment goals and objectives be different? How might you do a vulnerability assessment differently depending on your job goals? Yeah.
Well, it's either going to be like skirting the regulations or developing regulations.
Skirting the regulations or developing the regulations.
Yeah. It's like when, depending on what side of the equation you're on.
Right, exactly. So if you're supporting a tribe, if you're working for a tribal government, actually if you're working for a tribal government, maybe you're doing it both ways, right? On the one hand, you're saying, for ourselves as a tribe, we want to set regulations and make sure we as a tribe, achieve what we want to achieve. But if you're like, okay, so we've got the feds up there doing whatever the feds are doing, how can we make sure that we can still do what we need to do despite how the feds want us to do things? Not that any of you have any experience with that, I'm sure. Right. And there again, there are going to be objectives you're happy to share with everyone else, and goals and objectives that you're not. I mean, like if you're only doing something because your boss told you to, you're probably not going to write that in any document. I'm doing this because I was told I had to. No, you're going to say the reasons why maybe your boss cares, and you're not going to say, yeah, we're doing this so we can figure out how to work around federal regulations. You're not going to put that in some big document that the world sees, but it's still good to know in your head if that's someplace you want to get. Yeah. How else might the focus of your vulnerability assessment be different for different jobs? Like if you're writing a grant versus developing an adaptation plan, how much of a vulnerability assessment would you need to feed into writing a grant versus writing an adaptation plan?
Looking at pilots. We're looking at smaller, breaking it down. Let's do a small one and see how that goes, and then we might work our way toward a larger one.
Right. So doing pilot vulnerability assessments again. So in this training, you'll get this. I forget how many steps we have in our capstone exercise now, but you'll be walking through it in a few hours total. So maybe if you're writing a grant, something like that is good. You don't go out and get a bunch of extra information necessarily. You run through some questions really quickly, and that gets you into the ballpark. Wow, based on this preliminary assessment, the things we're going to care about in terms of climate change and vulnerability are these three core things. But if you're writing an adaptation plan, you probably want to be a little more certain about the vulnerability assessment results, the sources of vulnerability, the things that are really vulnerable or not so vulnerable. So you would probably want a more in-depth vulnerability assessment. And if you know that you learn a lot during a vulnerability assessment, maybe you say, okay, we're going to write an adaptation plan. Maybe you want to do that as a 4-step process. We do a really preliminary vulnerability assessment plan, that we spend a week on. We do a preliminary adaptation plan that we spend a week on. And based on those conversations, then we say, okay, now we know a lot more about what information we need and what's going to matter to us when we write our full-on adaptation plan. And so you might change how you do the vulnerability assessment. Any thoughts or questions before I step off? All right. Again, I think the diversity of job responsibilities is it's an advantage. So talking to each other about what you do will bring in the different perspectives and help you maybe clarify your own objectives. All right. Thank you.